Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Where do you start with rebuilding Ukraine and who should pay? The costs will be huge and they're increasing daily. Maybe some kind of Marshall Plan, which the US funded for Europe after World War II. But that money came from over the Atlantic. This time, would Europe itself step up? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. And while we're talking about rebuilding Ukraine, what about other devastated nations? Yemen, Syria, there are more. Are they featuring in any conversation? In this program, we'll look at how much, how long, and who should foot the bill. This was the US president. The world is united in our support for Ukraine and our determination to make Putin pay a very heavy price. Putin, perhaps, but penalizing Russia as a whole, could that backfire as it did with Germany after 1918? It's going to take a great deal of thought. Let us first of all go to Austria, and there we see Janusz Kopasz, former director of the Energy Community Secretariat in Vienna. To Rome, and there we see Alisa Muzerg, senior research fellow at Eurocreative think tank. She is Ukrainian. And to Oxford, where we find Adnan Masarai, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, formerly a top guy at the International Monetary Fund. I'm going to read out something from what was called the European Recovery Plan, 1947, became known as the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall, who was the US Secretary of State, because I think it's extremely relevant today. And this is what he had to say. The truth of the matter is that Europe's requirements for the next 3 or 4 years of foreign food and other essential products, principally from America, are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character. We will come to the economics, to the money in this program, I can assure you, but I want to pick up on two things there. The social and political deterioration, the fear of that, because the Americans wanted this to happen so that poor people in Europe were no longer poor and didn't want to turn to communism. There is a real danger when a country collapses like Ukraine, Alisa, I'll come to you, that problems other than economic could follow, and they've got to prevent that.
Yeah, let's remember, first of all, that the war in Ukraine started not in February 22, but back in February 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the temporary occupation of Donbas, which obviously brought devastating economic damages, but also combined with terrible human losses and sufferings. In the previous 8 years of war, 20,000 of lives were taken. More than 4 million people became IDPs.
Okay,
and
with the greatest respect,
months,
we have been over this on many occasions on this program, and I want to get to the nitty-gritty about rebuilding Ukraine. There is a danger that if you only look at the economic side, then other problems could follow, political, social, that people could find trouble for idle hands, if you like.
Yeah, obviously there is a big humanitarian and political implications of this war, which we don't know until which extent it will last. And I would also like to raise a point that these consequences are felt and will be felt not only in Ukraine itself, but also globally. We speak more and more about the food crisis, global crisis. With regard to political consideration, I myself was working a lot on the EU integration of Ukraine, and we, together with our colleagues, are actually now working on asking our European colleagues to provide Ukraine candidate status, which will work not only as a powerful geopolitical message, but also will provide Ukraine access to the long-term EU funds, which I think the economic part will talk about later. So basically, I think now the ball on the side of the EU. Ukraine has done a lot on this matter. Ukraine has officially applied for the candidate status. Just yesterday, Ukrainian government submitted the first response to the EU questionnaire for the receiving of the candidate status. And I think this is political points up to discussion because EU Council will vote on this decision in June 2022, and there are still some countries which are doubting whether Ukraine should get the status. And I'm afraid that if it's not going to happen, the political consequences will be also devastating.
Yeah, Yannick, how do you prevent, you're a former foreign minister of Slovenia, so you know about looking after the political side of things. How do you, if you're given the money, and we'll get onto that in just a moment, prevent a social and political collapse, which is vital for the stability of Europe?
I have not much to add to what Lisa said, but so this is why this European perspective for Ukraine is so important, because Ukrainians need a vision, vision of better world. They had it from Maidan Revolution back in 2014-15, and need to continue.
So you have to find money immediately. Where do you go to for that?
Asking me?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, I mean, this money is, of course, will come, I think, from G7 countries primarily, and European Union. It will not come from regular European budget. Ukraine is not a member yet, and this is why European Union should establish a special recovery fund, or some in Brussels call it solidarity fund. And it will have to be designed anew, like Marshall Plan was designed anew. It cannot be a repetition of some existing mechanisms of support of neighboring countries in European Union, because all the procedures are simply useless for this situation.
Okay, Adnan, let me ask you this. Do you go after the Russian funds which are currently frozen? Half of the central bank funds are frozen, but they can't be accessed. Do you confiscate them? Do you enact legislation to make sure you get those Russian rubles immediately or as quickly as you can?
Well, depending on the country where those resources are located, and they're mostly in the US, there could be legal procedures started to have those reserves that are blocked to be used by the reconstruction effort. I should add at the same time that the International Monetary Fund has already set up a trust fund where different countries could contribute to and have the resources be used by Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine could also benefit from funding, not just from the European Union, but also from the international financial organizations such as the World Bank.
Am I right in thinking that the International Monetary Fund also has something in the order of 100 billion left over from money it had put to one side for the COVID recovery plans for certain Western countries? It hasn't used that, and this, it's being suggested, could go towards rebuilding Ukraine?
Well, the IMF has considerable amount of resources far above and beyond those numbers. The issue is Ukraine could possibly access to have a program with the IMF. At the same time, as you are aware, the IMF just created about $650 billion worth of reserves for various countries in the form of special drawing rights. And many countries could contribute parts of their allocations to that trust fund to be used for Ukraine.
I'm wondering about global support. You mentioned the G7. Let's hear from Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister.
So we must all collectively step up to provide humanitarian aid to support families affected by this war, and already start thinking about investing to rebuild Ukraine afterwards. We must all continue to send military equipment and lethal aid to help Ukrainians in their heroic defense, not just of their lands, but of all of the principles that defend ours.
Anissa, one of the problems is that exports are now at zero. There's massive inflation. GDP is falling. And port cities have been taken. Would one of the answers be to make sure that there were routes for exports through the western borders?
I think there is a lot of discussion happening on the after-war rebuilding, but unfortunately not that much on the short-term or rather mid-term emergency and structural support to Ukraine. And as you mentioned, currently most of the export and import blocked due to the blockage of the seaports of Ukraine on the Black and Azov Sea, which prevents huge volumes of trade. So the situation is especially gloomy for agricultural export of Ukraine. And as I mentioned already, it poses a great threat of hunger globally, especially in the Middle East and in the Africa. So one of our proposals actually to our European colleagues is to provide immediate support to develop the infrastructure and infrastructure hubs, I would say, on the regions of Ukraine, both in terms of railway hubs, roads, but even also rapid construction of the river port on the Danube to regain access.
But one of the problems I see there is that if you start to rebuild when somebody's still bombing you, there's a chance that you'll be doing it over and over and over again. You surely have to wait until there is some modicum of peace and stability in the country.
The question is how long we will wait, because also the military experts and even NATO Secretary General predicted that it will take years. And unfortunately, we cannot wait so long. And we see already, for example, in the Kiev region, which has just recently been freed from Russian military, the rebuild of infrastructure, of roads, of bridges is already ongoing.
Okay, so we've got roads, we've got bridges, we've got trains, but you also then have to, we've got homes as well, of course, but you have to persuade the labor force to be there to rebuild it. It's not going to come from elsewhere. You've got to ask Ukrainians to trust the policy enough to be prepared to come home to help with the rebuilding, those that are able.
Just yesterday, the Poland and bordering agency of Poland actually first time reported that there have been more Ukrainians who went back to Ukraine than they were leaving Ukraine, which I think is kind of a good message, and which visualizes that the Ukrainians actually are ready to go back home and to rebuild their country. And this is something that already is ongoing.
But Yannick, I would assume that with a large number of Ukrainian men still in their country fighting, and mostly women and children being among those who've become refugees or displaced, if you like, the EU is going to have to provide a labor force as well from its own countries.
Yeah, for sure. The reconstruction will request a lot of labor force, and I'm sure also labor force which is currently perhaps even not available in Ukraine, and on the other side has to be doubled, tripled compared to Ukrainian capacities, because the recovery has to be relatively fast. So simply, yes, there should be a lot of capital coming from the European Union, but also labor force to assist.
And Adnan, there will be a lot of people who look at this as a money-making opportunity, unfortunately. How do you prevent, how can you be certain, as best you can, that this money doesn't fall into the wrong hands?
Look, corruption is always a possibility in these kind of situations. And there is much to be learned from previous experiences. For example, in Afghanistan, where a lot of the money was squandered. In the past, whenever there have been concerns about corruption and governance issues in Ukraine as well, and anti-corruption has been part of the programs, for example, that the IMF has put together. The success of Ukraine in its reconstruction will depend on putting in place mechanisms for oversight of how these monies are used. These mechanisms could also benefit from participation by the European Union and, for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Best perhaps then to have one overseeing body that makes sure that all of those underneath it who are actually using the funds do so correctly, yeah?
Absolutely. Because in the past, what has happened, for example, again in Afghanistan, parts of the monies go through the budget of the country. Part of it goes through spending by the various donors, and there are huge coordination problems.
Is the priority, and I'll come to you, Yannick, first on this one, since you were part of the Slovenian government. Is the priority to spend, first of all, on regenerating industry, on infrastructure, spending money on defense? Is it possible to gauge at this stage where the priorities are?
Priorities are everywhere, but one of them, which you did mention, is give guarantees to small and medium-sized companies, because insurance is now a big issue, and if a local business cannot do normal business in normal conditions like other companies worldwide, they will simply not survive. So this one trust fund, I very much agree, there should be one authority or one fund overseeing all the donors' money, because otherwise there will be a lot of stepping on each other's toes and a lot of potential for corruption. Should offer grants, guarantees, insurance, and many other financial products, if I can put them that way. And of course, it will be everything at once: infrastructure, rebuilding of apartments or settlements, and so on and so on.
Well, homes are all very well. You need somewhere to live, but it's no good having somewhere to live if you don't have any food. It all fits together as part of one particular plan. Alisa, what do you make of Valeria Gontareva, former head of the Ukrainian Central Bank, when she says, with the necessary reforms, the right structure in place, that can be achieved within 3 years, and an economic recovery can be managed within 10 years?
Yeah, it all depends in which condition the Ukraine after the war will be, because we see now that the whole Donbass, which used to be previously an industrial powerhouse, basically turned into ruin. There have been quite different estimates of the cost, but obviously until the very end we will not be able to know the real numbers. Considering that there is a lot of already potential support, a lot of discussion on the Marshall Plan for Ukraine, there is a lot of willingness also from EU side, from EU neighbors to help Ukraine. I believe this plan is quite realistic.
Okay, how long do you think, because this is a yardstick, isn't it? How long do you think it took Japan, it took Germany to actually get back to, well, not just pre-World War II levels, but in fact be better than perhaps many of those they'd been fighting against? How long?
Difficult to predict. We see still that there is quite a different economic development in the eastern and western regions of Germany. Already quite a lot of years after the reunification of Germany and war. So I would not tell you the number.
Okay, well, Adnan, I've sort of read in various publications over the years that within 8-9 years, those two countries were actually probably better equipped to deal with the years that came than the UK, than France and other countries that they've been fighting against. The reunification of Germany that Alisa mentions there, that's a good model to follow as well, isn't it?
It is a good model. In some ways, the job in Ukraine will be simpler, and maybe only in one respect, in that the country has not been divided. Okay, and the country has been running under one economic and political system, so we don't need to change those. What is going to be particularly important in the case of Ukraine is going to be first, of course, in the short term, humanitarian, but a resumption of basic services and then moving to reconstruction of infrastructure. And this could be done. It will take many, many years. Remember that the entire Marshall Plan for Europe then costed $14 billion. In current dollars, about 64. And any number that I have seen for Ukraine is many, many times more than that.
You talk about division, which brings me to one of the questions I asked at the start of the program. Why is the focus on Ukraine rather than other places? Let's hear from the head of the World Health Organization.
I don't know if the world really gives equal attention to black and white lives. I said it last week. The whole attention to Ukraine is very important, of course, because it impacts the whole world. But even a fraction of it is not being given to Tigray, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, and the rest. A fraction. And I need to be blunt and honest that the world is not treating the human race same way. Some are more equal than others.
Yannick, it's an important point, not only that the head of the World Health Organization makes, but we hear from Adnan as well, that there is less division, perhaps, in Ukraine than there is in some of these other areas of conflict, where civil war has been an issue, and therefore it's going to be simpler to direct this kind of rebuilding project. Is it, therefore, wrong of him to say effectively, look, this is a moral dimension here. You're looking at Ukraine, you're not looking at the other countries you should be. It's not that simple.
No, it's not that simple, and Ukraine is relatively black-white situation. So on one side we have an aggression country with war crimes. On the other side we have a country which just wants to live its own life. And many people always say, you have different attitude in Europe towards refugees. You know, Ukrainians are welcome and the others are not. But we have to admit that from Ukraine, only women and children are coming as refugees, not men. And perception in European society. So I think it's very, once again, black-white. We all support Ukraine, and we, of course, keep fingers crossed they will succeed.
How do you convince people that their attention should be equally divided, or do you not bother?
This is, I mean, it's hard to convince with logic. You know, this is, I would say, emotional attitude.
And people are probably more touched immediately, I get this, by what is happening in Ukraine, particularly across Europe. Adnan, I think you wanted to say something, and then, Elisa, I'll come back to you for a final word on life for your family and relatives who are still in Ukraine. Adnan.
Look, the kindest interpretation you may put on the differences of treatment of various countries is that people care more about people who look like them and are of the same culture. The case of Syria has been extremely horrendous because much of what has been happening in Ukraine, similar things have been done, plus there has been considerable use of chemical weapons, which makes the situation very, very bad. It is true that places like Syria and Yemen have been suffering from civil wars, and coming to peace and coming around a table internationally to help them will be more difficult.
Elisa, let me ask you this. You're relatively young. I don't know whether you see a future for yourself in Ukraine, but perhaps you can imagine a day when you might go back to a country that is once again prosperous and not facing threats from outside. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I am, together as my friends, we are very positive about the future of our country. And moreover, being based in Italy, I'm actually working every day for international organization on the project related to Ukraine, related to reform of justice sector, anti-corruption reform, more recently investigation of war crimes. So obviously didn't leave my country, and myself come from a town of Izium, the town which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, and where this very moment the fate of the east and of Donbass is being decided because of its strategic position. So obviously for me it's a very personal issue. I was raised in this town. I still have family there with whom I have no connection for almost a month. So it's very catastrophic and devastating, but I still hope for a positive future for our country.
I'm sure you do, but do you look at the situation now and think no matter how much countries may talk a good talk about rebuilding Ukraine, there is still a great deal of pain to be endured by your fellow countrymen and women and your family out there?
No, absolutely. I think this pain we are going through, all this suffering will stay with us forever, and probably not only with us, but with our future generation of our children and grandchildren. It's also a big question how we're going to live still next to our neighbor country, and how we will be able in future to sustain any kind of normal relations. I think this is the matter we will have to face in the future as well.
There's more than just one way to rebuild. Thank you very much indeed, all three of you, for coming on this edition of Roundtable about the future of Ukraine, not just politically, but in terms of the amount of money it might need to rebuild homes, businesses, and everything else that has been destroyed in the course of the last 2 months. I'm David Foster. Wherever you're watching this edition of Roundtable, we thank you very much indeed and hope to have your company next time. Goodbye.